We often hear debate about Canada's equalization payments program. There are have and have not provinces. Much of those payments come from Alberta and get redistributed to other provinces such as Quebec. Is this fair? Does something need to change? Our guest today is Dr. Ted Morton. He is a former Alberta Conservative cabinet minister and one of the co-authors of the famous Alberta Firewall Letter. He's also the vice president of Fairness Alberta. Ted, it's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you today, Naveen.
So let's start with the issue of equalization payments. Although there are many other issues that we need to touch on as well, the equalization program is complicated. So can you briefly explain how equalization works in Canada and how much money Albertans are paying to other provinces annually in equalization payments, and what's the grand total over the years?
To answer that question would take our entire 15 minutes. There's no brief explanation, but very briefly, there's a concept called fiscal capacity, the ability of each of the 10 provinces, their ability to raise revenues. And Alberta ranks high on that. And so the higher your rank, the more you pay in. The lower your fiscal capacity, the more you get. Equalization program in Canada is about a $20 million a year program. Um, Alberta, what Alberta pays into equalization is only about $3 billion a year. We pay another $3 billion a year in other types of direct payments, what's called the Canada Health Transfer, the Canada Social Transfer. Um, those are payments that go directly from Ottawa to provincial governments. And so that you're looking at around $6 billion a year. But that's only a small portion of the overall net loss of revenues out of Alberta to Ottawa. Those are payments that go to Ottawa and then directly to other provincial governments. There's also money that leaves Alberta that doesn't come back. That's not to governments, but just individuals. The Canada Pension Plan, employment insurance. We contribute much, much more into those than we get back because we have a younger workforce, fewer people. We're taking pensions, more people paying in. Same thing on employment insurance. We've historically had lower employment. So when you add it all together, the equalization program, it's a $20 billion a year program. Alberta only puts in about $3 billion net because we don't get anything from it because our fiscal capacity is high. But that's only a fraction of the 15 to $20 billion a year that has been net leaving Alberta over the last 2 decades.
Okay, so 15 to 20 billion, that's a crazy amount of money. So one complaint might be, why should Alberta subsidize other provinces like Ontario and Quebec? Are we simply rewarding poor fiscal management and high spending?
In part, that's part of the equalization program. The government works better when the people making decisions are directly accountable to the people who are paying the taxes. And what's happening here with equalization and these other transfer programs is the money is leaving Alberta to go to Ottawa and then either being spent by Ottawa, not coming back to Albertans that pay in Canada Pension Plan, employment insurance, or going directly to other provinces. And just to give you, I think what has been aggravating, to say the least, to many Albertans on the equalization program alone, it's about a $20 billion a year program. Over the past 2 decades, Quebec has regularly received 66 cents of every equalization dollar. 2/3 of that $20 billion a year goes to Quebec. And we can get into why that happens if you want, but I think that's been very aggravating to Albertans, and particularly um, the the things have been better for the last couple years, but the decade of from 2010 to 2020 were tough years for Alberta economically. We were debt free. We worked hard to Ralph Klein had paid off the debt. The Stelmach government, we didn't do as I was part of the government I was part of. We didn't do as good a job as we should have in terms of fiscal management. We didn't run up any new debt. In the next decade, there was close to um, 80 or 90 billion dollars of debt in Alberta because of the decline in the economy. But Alberta was still paying 15 to 20 billion dollars a year net to Ottawa for equalization and these other programs while we were running up 80 or 90 billion dollars worth of debt. So that doesn't strike people as fair. When we're in recession and running up debt, why are we sending money to directly to other provincial governments?
Let's talk on Quebec for a bit there, because you were saying that that Quebec gets a higher amount of equalization payments, and it has something to do with language.
66 cents out of every dollar.
Right, and you were saying it had something to do with Quebec's language laws. Let's hear about that.
Well, again, this is kind of a baby boom. The Separatist Party became strong in Quebec in the late 70s and has been there. The separatist threat has been there since the late 70s. Pierre Trudeau's highest priority, the Liberal Party's highest priority, was to prevent Quebec separatism. And I think that has continued to be the highest priority of the Liberal Party of Canada for the last, well, in my adult lifetime, from the 1980s right up till now. And basically, keeping Quebec happy has been a priority for the Liberal Party. Partly, you could say, for patriotic reasons, but also it's how the Liberal Party wins elections. Take the election we just had. How many votes did the Liberal Party get in Alberta and Saskatchewan? How many MPs were elected in Alberta and Saskatchewan? I think four, four out of 50. But between the two, Ontario and Quebec by themselves have 200 MPs. For a majority, you need 172 MPs. So Ontario and Quebec by themselves can elect majority governments. And I think 2/3 of the new prime minister's government, he's at 170 MPs. He's just shy of that 172 majority. But 2/3 of MPs, if his MPs, are from Ontario and Quebec. So the in a talking about equalization and fiscal transfer is just kind of the macro, the micro issue, actually tracing dollars and cents, leaving Alberta and going elsewhere. But at a macro level, sort of in a broader sense, Alberta is constitutionally very vulnerable to a political strategy which says for the federal government, and mainly the Liberal Party, if we move money from resource-rich but voter-poor Western Canada to resource-poor but voter-rich Ontario, we can win elections.
So, what would you like to see changed in the equalization formula?
That's technical. To take a few highlights. Right now, the so-called fiscal capacity formulas, they look at the GDP of each province, right? But it doesn't look at the cost of delivering healthcare in any province. Well, the cost of delivering healthcare in Toronto, in Alberta, BC, and Ontario is much higher than it is in Quebec or Atlantic Canada, because housing is much more expensive in the provinces I just mentioned. In the pay-in provinces, salaries are lower. So there should be not just how much they're spending, but what it costs to deliver health, not just fiscal capacity. There are other examples. Non-renewable natural resources, in other words, oil and gas, are counted as part of fiscal capacity. So one of the reasons Alberta gets leaned on so heavily, or to be more blunt, gets drained so heavily, 15 to 20 billion dollars a year, because that includes government of Alberta revenues from oil and gas royalties and other income from oil and gas, non-renewable resources. So, but on the other hand, in Quebec, Quebec has a big hydroelectric operation, which generates lots of money for the Quebec government. That's not included in fiscal capacity. So why is our non-renewable resources, in a certain sense, shouldn't be considered in fiscal capacity? Because once a barrel of oil comes out of the ground in Alberta is sold, that is a commodity. That is an asset we have that we no longer have, right? It's gone forever. Once a barrel of oil is taken out of the ground in Alberta and sold, Albertans have lost that royalty. Hydroelectric power is renewable. It goes year after year. So things like that Western Canadian oil and gas is included in fiscal capacity, but not but provincially owned. In the case of Quebec, their hydro operation is not included, leads to these imbalances. So that would be an example of couple of examples of what's wrong with the equalization formula and what could be reformed.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of oil and gas, because there's also other issues, including federal policies that target Alberta disproportionately. So why are there offshore oil tanker restrictions on the West Coast that do not exist on the East Coast or the St. Lawrence Seaway? How does that make sense?
I'm afraid it doesn't make any sense at all because, as you said, that the ban on oil and gas tankers on off the BC coast is one of the Trudeau initiatives that chased tens of billions of dollars of investment out of Alberta, out of Western Canada in the 10 years that Trudeau was there. But tankers come down the Gulf, down the St. Lawrence River, Quebec City, Montreal at the same time. So again, it's a double standard. Quebec, there are lots of refineries in Quebec, employs lots of people, creates jobs, income, and so forth. So again, it's another double standard that goes back to the what I would call the federal framework, particularly the Liberal Party's framework of going to great lengths to appease Quebec, not to upset Quebec. And at the same time being able to take the double standard because they don't pay a price for it in the West because there's so few. They don't need to elect any MPs out of Alberta and Saskatchewan to get their majority governments in Ottawa.
Now, you're not necessarily for separation or anything like that, and even though there are like more calls for it. Separation aside, are there any particular steps Alberta can take just to leverage a better deal with the federal government?
What I'm about to say, I don't like to say, but I think it's the case, and that's what I wrote in the book, that the strategies that my generation used, the baby boom generation, the Klein government, and the other, both conservative and NDP governments since the 1980s, they haven't worked. We're worse off. We're more vulnerable today to predatory, destructive federal policies than we were in the 1980s. The gains that we'd made in the early 80s, early 90s have been wiped out and evaporated. So this, I think, will make sense to your viewers that the people who benefit from this, which is the Liberal Party and Quebec, the people who the beneficiaries of the status quo don't voluntarily give up their advantages. So to get change is going to require a push. And I think push is what Jason Kenney started when he was premier. And with his Fair Deal Committee and the recommendations they made, his referendum on abolishing equalization, that was Kenney beginning the push. And now Danielle Smith has continued the push to change. And she's been very clear, in addition to demanding the changes in all the anti-oil and gas, anti-energy policies of the Trudeau era, she's also moving forward. To go back to how you introduced me as one of the writers of the firewall back in the firewall letter back in 2000, some of the recommendations we made there, our own provincial police force, like Ontario and Quebec, collecting our own taxes, provincial taxes, like Quebec already does, having our own pension plan, pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan. Quebec, each province is entitled to its own pension plan. Quebec doesn't. That's the push, and I think that's what Danielle Smith is started, and so She struck this next committee. I believe they're going to be out holding town halls all next summer, listening to Albertans and then coming back with new recommendations. And of course, waiting to see what the new prime minister does. The new prime minister has a long history of being a lot greener than Justin Trudeau. Those were the policies that have harmed Alberta, Saskatchewan economically in the past decade. So there's also kind of in a trial marriage between the prime minister and the premiers of Saskatchewan to see what happens in the next 4 to 5 months. So it's going to be a very interesting summer and fall.
Of course, yes. Ted Morton is the Vice President of Fairness Alberta. Ted, thank you so much for being with us today.
I hope we shed some light on a murky subject. Thank you.
We
But
sure did.
a murky subject, but an important subject.